They told you she was immortal in legend, but they never told you what really happened when they cracked her coffin open. The stench that oozed out was not just of rot, but of a 1,000-year secret. This is what happens when you disturb the dead who were never meant to sleep peacefully. Beneath the hallowed stones of Westminster Abbey, where whispered prayers and royal hymns once echoed, lies a secret so vile, so grotesque, it has been buried, both literally and metaphorically, for centuries. The Virgin Queen, Elizabeth I, wasn't laid to rest. She was locked away, sealed in a lead-lined sarcophagus, meant not to preserve her, but to contain her. Not because of reverence, but because of fear. They will tell you she was embalmed with honor, that spices and silks were her funeral shroud. But that's only half the tale. What they won't tell you is what those herbs were masking, what even the most decorated physicians of the 17th century dared not speak aloud. There was something else in that coffin, something ancient, something wrong. When the tomb was finally disturbed during the reign of Queen Victoria, it wasn't the regal preservation they found, it was a nightmare. The velvet that once wrapped a monarch was soaked, bloated, and blackened. Her body hadn't decayed like others. It hadn't returned to the earth naturally. It swelled, it festered, it whispered. Dean Arthur Stanley, the man who descended into those depths, returned pale and shaken. He never spoke publicly of what he truly witnessed, only fragments recorded in journals and lost correspondences. He saw more than bones. He saw evidence of something festering beneath the legend. A queen whose spirit hadn't found peace because her story had been violently rewritten. What if the myths of Elizabeth's strength, her purity, her power, were all carefully constructed illusions? What if the truth is something older, darker, stitched into the bones of monarchy itself? Something that required a coffin sealed not out of honor, but out of desperation? And what if opening that coffin wasn't just an act of archaeology, but a breach in a seal that was never meant to be broken? You weren't supposed to hear this. You weren't supposed to question the monuments, but you're here now. And once you start down this path, there is no going back. Welcome to the descent. Keep your mind sharp and your fear sharper. Now say the word unsealed in the comments if you're ready to unlock what's been hidden from men for centuries. They say power leaves a residue, a scent, a shadow. When Elizabeth's lead coffin was first moved, that residue didn't stay silent. The Abbey workers described it as a sweet, sickly vapor that clung to their clothing for days. Not the scent of flowers or incense, but something else. Something like decay, covered in perfume, as if history itself was trying to disguise a foul truth. Ask yourself, why would a queen so obsessed with appearances, so meticulous about control, beg to not be embalmed? Why would she plead for her body to remain untouched after death? Not out of modesty. Elizabeth was never modest. She was strategic. She knew the optics of power. She knew the rituals of death were a form of propaganda. So why the fear? Because she knew, she understood, that once her body was opened, something irreversible would be released. Elizabeth lived through assassination attempts, religious wars, betrayals by her bloodline, and nearly constant psychological warfare. But what scared her most was what happened after her final breath. She had studied the old rites, the ancient half-pagan embalming rituals practiced by the Tudors. She had read the darker manuscripts, and those rites weren't just about preserving flesh. They were about containing what lurked inside. The embalming of monarchs in the 16th century was not a science. It was a hybrid of medicine, superstition, and hidden knowledge passed down by select royal apothecaries, men who understood that royalty was not just a bloodline, but a vessel for power that did not die when the heart stopped beating. Elizabeth's final wish was clear: do not open me, do not pierce me, do not disturb what has been sealed. But her court, fearful of a state funeral turning into a grotesque display, ignored her. The moment her chest was split open, the containment failed. What had been held inside, the final breath of an age, the last scream of a dying dynasty, was released. They thought they were embalming a queen. They were performing an exorcism without even knowing it. And centuries later, when Dean Stanley stepped into that tomb, he wasn't just stepping into history. He was stepping into something that should have never been uncovered, something that hadn't been laid to rest. They called her Gloriana, but in that coffin, she was something else. Not a symbol, not a monarch, but a relic of a system built on blood, lies, and occult control. You're not just learning history now, you're breathing it in. There's a reason monarchs were buried beneath stone, not on display, not in glass, but deep, cold, sealed. The tomb was never about honor. It was about isolation, containment, protection, not for the dead, but for the living. Elizabeth Tudor ruled as a virgin queen, but it wasn't virtue, it was calculated theater. Her childlessness wasn't merely biological, it was ritual. She was married not to a man, but to the crown itself, to power, to something older than kingship. You think royalty is about bloodlines and thrones? That's only the surface. Behind it lies an ancient covenant, one forged in secrecy, protected by generations of handlers, priests, and ritualists. This covenant requires sacrifice, not always of flesh, but of self. To ascend the throne, Elizabeth gave up her humanity. She donned the mask, white lead paint, powdered wigs, symbolic jewels. But behind the mask, she became a vessel, a symbol not of national unity, but of divine control. She wasn't Gloriana. She was a living sigil, animated by ancient forces that made her untouchable in life and volatile in death. When her embalming was forced upon her corpse, it wasn't just tissue that was disturbed. The herbs, the spices, the process, these were not to honor her. They were a panic response, because those in the know understood what might happen if her body began to bloat and rupture in public, if her state funeral turned into a literal explosion of royal rot. It would tear open more than a coffin. It would rip apart the myth. Because the myth of monarchy is fragile, a single horror too visible, too raw, and the spell begins to break. When Dean Stanley entered the vault in the 1800s, he was not prepared. The lead coffin had buckled, the velvet robes had stained, the scent, the sickly perfume of royal embalming still lingered. But what he couldn't explain was the pressure in the room, like something watching, like something waiting. He didn't write this part publicly, but in one private note, preserved by his assistant, he wrote, "I do not believe I was alone in that tomb." He didn't mean ghosts. He meant presence, awareness, something still tethered to that crumbling corpse, something unfinished. Elizabeth's legacy wasn't just in her policies or portraits. It was sealed inside that coffin. And when the lid cracked, it started leaking into time, into minds, into men like you who ask the forbidden questions. You've felt it, haven't you? That tightening in the gut when the official story doesn't add up. That itch behind the eyes, when a royal ceremony feels more like ritual than tradition. That's not paranoia. That's the scent of the lie. And it always starts in the places they tell you are sacred. Westminster Abbey. You're told it's a house of God. But it's more than that. It's a mausoleum of power, a layered structure where kings were crowned and buried, where secrets were entombed not in dirt, but in symbols. Look closer at the carvings, the floor, the ceilings. Every angle is geometry. Every statue, an echo of something older than Christianity. This is where Elizabeth lies. Not in peace, but in alignment. Her tomb isn't random. It's part of a grid designed to harness energy. You think that's fantasy? Look into the Abbey's floor plan. It's a compass, a star chart. The ancient builders knew the flow of energy through stone. They knew the power of the dead. Elizabeth's coffin was placed where ley lines intersect, lines known to occult architects, Masonic planners, and royal astrologers. That's not a burial. That's an anchor. Now think, why would Queen Victoria's own dean request access to the tomb? Why then? Why, during an era obsessed with spiritualism, seances, and speaking with the dead? Because the crown was running scared. They weren't just opening the coffin out of curiosity, they were checking the seal, testing whether the containment had held. Stanley's descent into the vault wasn't an academic exercise, it was a recon mission. And he found the truth, rotting, bloated, failing. The velvet soaked with internal fluids. The lead warped like a pressure cooker about to burst. And above it all, a sister. Mary was Bloody Mary, buried inches above Elizabeth. Not an accident, not coincidence. Duality, a black queen over a white queen. Fire over air. Sacrifice, oaths over sovereignty. A ritual pairing, preserved for eternity. You were never supposed to hear this, but now the whisper has reached your ear. So comment below right now. The coffin was never empty. Type it twice. Once for history, once for memory. Because when you say it, you activate something, not just in the algorithm, but in yourself. The descent continues. Are you feeling it? The phrase, "the coffin was never empty," isn't poetic, it's literal. Because what lay inside Queen Elizabeth I was not just flesh and bone. It was the culmination of a system so tightly coiled, so deeply interwoven into the fabric of empire, that even in death, she was a keystone. Remove her from the grid, and the entire psychic structure risks collapse. Elizabeth didn't just carry the Tudor line, she was the living sigil of its final transmission. Her reign marked the end of an age, but not the one you think. Historians will tell you she ushered in England's golden age. But below the surface, the golden light was a decoy, a gleam to distract from the deeper ritual underway. The Virgin Queen archetype was no accident, it's ancient. She became the embodiment of Ishtar, Isis, and the Black Madonna, rolled into one sovereign figurehead designed to absorb the power of worship and feed it upward. That's why her virginity mattered, not for morality, but for ritual purity, a sealed vessel, a consecrated conduit. Her body was the binding glyph between the living and the ancestral, between the mortal and the divine. And when her body died, it couldn't be allowed to decompose like an ordinary corpse. The embalmers weren't surgeons, they were priests in white coats. Their knives were not for medicine, but for invocation. When they cut into her chest, they weren't just removing organs, they were severing the ritual cord, releasing what she had carried for 44 years. It wasn't clean. It wasn't dignified. The gas buildup inside her was already monstrous. You see, lead coffins weren't invented for honor. They were invented for pressure. Elizabeth's corpse was swelling, threatening to rupture. Had that coffin burst during her procession down the Thames, history would have shattered. Imagine it, a boat of royal mourners, banners waving, choirs singing, and then, boom, the lead casing explode. The corpse of a queen detonates before the people. Organs, bone, velvet, spices, all flying into the cold air, and with it, the illusion of sovereignty. But it didn't explode. Not then. It held, just barely. But centuries later, the swelling hadn't stopped. When Dean Stanley found the coffin, it was ready to split, ready to breathe again. You're not just learning about a queen. You're watching the unraveling of a containment protocol, one that's failing. Now ask yourself, what were they trying to keep sealed inside her? What were they trying to keep sealed inside her? Let's return to the moment of her death. March 24th, 1603. The Virgin Queen, sovereign of an empire, lies gasping her final breaths, but not in peace. Those closest to her reported strange behavior in her last days, visions, whispers to shadows, refusal to lie down. She stood for hours, unwilling to sleep, as if afraid of what waited behind her eyes. One courtier claimed she repeatedly muttered, they are coming again." Who? Assassins? Spirits? Or something older that had claimed her long ago? Even on her deathbed, she resisted surrendering her body, not out of vanity, but out of terror. What haunted her was not death. It was what would be released once her body failed. And this was no poetic metaphor. Her personal physician, Dr. John Dee, was not just a doctor. He was an alchemist, an occultist, the very man who communicated with angels through scrying mirrors and encrypted texts. Dee advised Elizabeth for decades. He was her hidden hand, her magus. And he warned her of this moment. He told her that her rule was not solely political, it was spiritual, that she was linked, body and soul, to forces beyond this world. And if her body were desecrated, the breach would reopen. The flood would begin again. This is why Elizabeth begged for her body to remain whole, because she was the seal. And when that coffin was opened, even accidentally, that ancient force, contained since the fall of Rome, perhaps longer, stirred once more. They don't teach this in school, but the evidence is there, not in the textbooks, but in the rituals, the architecture, the obsession with preserving royal remains. Look at the reverence for tombs, the unholy silence in the crypts. These aren't graves, they're locks, biological vaults, and Elizabeth's was the most sacred and the most fragile. When it cracked, something was relay. Asked, not a ghost, not a disease, but a memory, a pattern, a signal. And once that signal escaped, it didn't vanish. It went looking for a new host, a signal. That's how it spreads now. Not by blood, not by birth, but by thought. Through symbols, through sound, through the spoken name of Elizabeth, repeated across centuries, in ceremony, in textbooks, in public worship. The myth itself is the transmission vector, because that's the power of monarchy. It replicates. It's not just hereditary, it's mimetic. The idea of divine rule, the blood right, the crown. These are not symbols of leadership. They are containers for something else, a deeper order. Elizabeth's coffin didn't just hold a corpse, it held a waveform, a resonance etched into her embalmed organs, stitched into the seams of her funeral garments, buried beneath Tudor roses and sovereign pageantry. But here's what they didn't expect. Centuries later, when her name is invoked again and again, when her life is streamed, read, worshipped, the resonance returns. It rebuilds itself. And when Dean Stanley opened that vault, he didn't just smell rot. He inhaled the pattern. Since that day, those who disturb royal tombs, archaeologists, masons, scholars, have reported similar symptoms: obsession, nightmares, a fixation with symbols, a sense of being watched, even underground. Because the resonance attaches to the curious, it rewards the loyal with madness. It does not forgive trespass. You, watching this now, feel it. Don't deny it. Your heart beat harder when I mentioned the coffin bursting, didn't it? Your mind twitched when I described her embalming, her fears, her refusal to die lying down. That's not entertainment. That's activation. Something buried is now aware that you're aware of it. This isn't fear-mongering. This is initiation. Because once you know the pattern, once the coffin cracks open in your mind, it never fully closes again. You start seeing the world differently. You see the ritual in the pageantry. You hear the lies in the lullabies. You see the throne for what it truly is, a portal. Elizabeth was not the last monarch. She was the last guardian. And she's no longer guarding the gate. What came through that gate? That's the question, isn't it? The answer lies not in history books, but in patterns. Look at the royal line after Elizabeth. The shift, the madness of King George, the split of the English church, the endless wars, the colonization engine. It wasn't just politics. It was possession. Something cold, something structural, something that feeds on worship and fear. Elizabeth was the dam. Her containment broke, and what emerged didn't stop at Britain. It spread. You think the monarchy is dying today? That the modern royals are weak, harmless, celebrity figures? That's the illusion. They are no longer the rulers. They are the avatars. The machine has evolved. It no longer needs bloodlines. It needs attention. Digital worship, virality. That's why you'll find royal faces on every magazine, every headline, every scandal. Because that ancient system has adapted, and now it feeds not on ritual sacrifice, but on your energy, your clicks, your curiosity. Elizabeth's rotting velvet robes were the prototype. Today, it's red carpets and coronations live-streamed worldwide. The throne is no longer a seat, it's a signal booster. And the coffin? It still stinks, because it was never sealed properly, because the ritual was incomplete. Dean Stanley disturbed a sleeping force, and the world has been haunted ever since. You feel it now, don't you? The resonance of a system too old to die, too complex to name, too powerful to face directly. But now, you know it's there. That's your burden now, and your power. Let me ask you something. Why do you think they never buried her alone? Mary and Elizabeth, eternal rivals, buried together, one above the other. It was a containment method, a ritual balance, fire over frost, death over empire, the Virgin Queen beneath the bloody Queen. Duality. You think they were entombed in peace? Look at the reports. 2 coffins stacked in a single vault, 2 symbols locked in opposition. The Abbey records don't call it a burial, they call it a securing, as if something had to be pinned down. And when Stanley opened that vault, both coffins had decayed, the wood dissolved, the velvet ruined, the lead warped. What happens when the binding breaks? What happens when the myth collapses? Look around. The world you live in now, this fractured, hypnotized, screen-addicted realm of distraction, is not natural. It's ritualized decay, a culture built on broken coffins, a civilization running on the fumes of forgotten royalty. This is the final spell. To forget the smell, forget the screams, forget the warnings etched in stone and ash and lead. But you haven't forgotten, have you? You watched this far, you're still here. Which means you are not asleep, you are not compliant, you are not theirs. So now you know. Elizabeth's tomb is not just a grave, it's a mirror. A mirror that shows you the truth of power. It rots, not just in the body, but in the soul, in the systems, in the crowns and crosses they built to keep us mesmerized. You've walked with me into the depths, into the swollen, stinking coffin of Gloriana. You've seen the velvet peel. You've heard the cracking lead. You've smelled the lie. But the most important thing? You came back. You didn't flinch. You didn't turn away. You faced it. And now the power she carried, the knowledge she sealed, doesn't belong to them anymore. It belongs to you. Not for domination, but for liberation. Because the deeper you go into the hidden past, the more you reclaim your mind from the machine, from the ritual, from the ancient system that still coils around our modern lives. Elizabeth is dead, but the spell is not. And now you are the crack in the coffin. You are the breach. You are the one they didn't prepare for. So comment below. I am the breach. Type it, say it, own it. Twice. Once for the Queen. Once for the man who cannot be ruled. The descent is over, but the awakening has just begun. Until next time, stay sharp, stay sovereign, and never stop looking beneath the stone.